This offense may carry the death penalty or pursuant to Utah Code 76.3-207.7, a mandatory term of imprisonment for life without parole.
After being sentenced to death for the murder of Charlie Kirk, Tyler James Robinson collapsed inside the courtroom. Authorities never confirmed a clear motive, but he once texted his partner, "I had enough of his hatred. Some hate can't be negotiated out. Let's get into what happened." The murder of Charlie Kirk and the trial that shook America. The assassination of Charlie Kirk sent shockwaves through the American political landscape, collapsing the fragile line between rhetoric and violence in a country already defined by bitter division. On September 10, 2025, Kirk, a 31-year-old conservative commentator, activist, and founder of Turning Point USA, was gunned down in Utah County by 27-year-old Tyler James Robinson. Court documents and early proceedings revealed a chilling motive. Robinson deliberately targeted Kirk based on his political identity, a direct violation of federal and state statutes concerning victim-targeted violence. In his first appearance before the court, Robinson was advised of his rights. The presiding judge outlined the framework of the trial, reminding Robinson that he had the constitutional right to remain silent, that anything said could be used against him, and that due to the seriousness of the charges, a Rule 8 qualified attorney would be provisionally appointed. Rule 8 guidelines specify the heightened legal experience required of attorneys in death penalty cases. Robinson was declared indigent after review of his financial status, meaning he could not afford counsel, and the court committed to appointing representation before the next hearing date.
Mr. Robinson at this time will remain in custody without bail.
Prosecutors from Utah County, led by Chad Grunanda, confirmed they had already filed a notice of intent to seek the death penalty. This procedural move escalated the stakes dramatically. Robinson now faced the ultimate punishment under Utah law. Prosecutors also secured a pre-trial protective order for Erica Kirk, the widow of Charlie Kirk, shielding her from potential intimidation or harassment. Grunanda emphasized the state's readiness to collect and disseminate discovery materials within the 5-day statutory requirement, reinforcing the prosecution's preparedness.
We did file just recently, within the last few minutes, a notice of intent to seek the death penalty.
The charges read in open court illustrated both the brutality and calculated nature of the attack. Count 1, aggravated murder, a capital felony, alleged Robinson intentionally killed Kirk, knowing his actions created a risk to others. Conviction carried the possibility of the death penalty or life imprisonment without parole. Count 2, felony discharge of a firearm, added further weight, asserting Robinson knowingly endangered Kirk with the firearm, causing serious injury before death, also subject to victim targeting enhancements. Counts 3 and 4, obstruction of justice, documented efforts to hinder the investigation, concealing the weapon, and destroying the clothing worn during the shooting. Counts 5 and 6, tampering with a witness, accused Robinson of directing his roommate to delete incriminating texts and remain silent during questioning. Finally, count 7, a misdemeanor, alleged Robinson committed homicide, compounding aggravation. Each count reinforced that this was not random violence, but targeted, premeditated political assassination. National reaction was immediate. Prominent voices across the spectrum condemned the killing, but deep fissures emerged. Commentators observed grotesque celebration from some online circles, revealing how tribal partisanship has numbed moral boundaries. Late-night coverage, like that of Jimmy Kimmel, expressed shock at such vile responses. He noted how, instead of mourning, certain factions treated the murder of Kirk as political theater.
I've seen a lot of extraordinarily vile responses to this from both sides of the political spectrum. Some people are cheering this, which is something I won't ever understand.
Former President Donald Trump's response inflamed the climate further. Historically, presidents have used moments of national tragedy to call for unity. George W. Bush after 9/11, Barack Obama after mass shootings, Joe Biden after violent incidents. Trump, however, broke this precedent. Instead of calling for reconciliation, he blamed Democrats and the radical left for creating a culture of dangerous rhetoric. His claim that his opponents bore responsibility ignored his own incendiary record, from suggesting Second Amendment people could stop Hillary Clinton to urging violence against journalists. Coverage pointed to Trump's role in escalating hostile language that blurred the line between speech and action. This reaction deepened partisan fracture. For Trump's supporters, the framing reinforced their view that conservative voices were under targeted attack. For critics, it demonstrated hypocrisy. A figure who normalized violent rhetoric was now weaponizing tragedy to further polarize. Political analysts warned that instead of de-escalating, Trump's approach risked accelerating cycles of hostility, embedding violence as an accepted response to ideological conflict. Into this volatile moment stepped Senator Bernie Sanders, delivering remarks that reframed the murder as not just a crime, but a symptom of an escalating national crisis. Sanders, who disagreed with Kirk on virtually every policy issue, nonetheless issued a solemn statement of condolence to his family. He emphasized the democratic principle that citizens must be able to participate in public life, speak freely, and organize without fear of violence. He called the assassination political cowardice, asserting that violence replaces persuasion with force and corrodes democracy.
A free and democratic society, which is what America is supposed to be about, depends upon the basic premise that people can speak out, organize, and take part in public life without fear.
Sanders situated Kirk's murder within a disturbing pattern: the January 6th Capitol attack, the attempted assassination of Donald Trump, the assault on Paul Pelosi, the attempted kidnapping of Governor Whitmer, the arson targeting Governor Josh Shapiro, the murder of Minnesota Speaker Melissa Hortman and her husband, the shooting of Representative Steve Scalise, and beyond. He linked this modern wave of political violence to historic tragedies: the assassinations of John F. Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr., Medgar Evers, John Lennon, and the attempted killings of Ronald Reagan and George Wallace. For Sanders, Kirk's murder was not an isolated act, but evidence of democracy hollowing out under the weight of fear and intimidation. The juxtaposition of Trump and Sanders' responses encapsulated America's divide: one leader weaponizing tragedy for partisan gain, another urging universal condemnation of violence irrespective of ideology. Media outlets underscored the contrast, warning that the nation's response to Kirk's murder could set a precedent for how future political violence is normalized or resisted. In the days following the murder, public discourse splintered into multiple narratives. Conservative voices framed Kirk as a martyr, a casualty of a hostile climate stoked by the left. Progressive voices condemned violence while cautioning against using Kirk's death to justify authoritarian crackdowns. Meanwhile, extremist elements online glorified the killing, further poisoning civic dialogue. Analysts warned that this normalization of violence as partisan expression risked spiraling into cycles of retaliation, undermining both free speech and public safety. At the center of it all, Tyler Robinson awaited trial. His court appearances became symbols of a nation watching itself unravel, one side demanding his execution, the other interpreting his prosecution as a distraction from systemic political grievances. By the conclusion of his arraignment, it was clear that Robinson's case was not merely about criminal culpability, but about whether America could withstand the gravitational pull of political violence without collapsing into normalized extremism. The sentencing, the collapse, and the spectacle of justice. The trial of Tyler James Robinson unfolded under national scrutiny, described by legal analysts as one of the most politically consequential murder cases of the decade. Prosecutors, led by Utah County Attorney Jeff Gray and trial counsel Chad Grunander, pursued the death penalty from the outset, framing Robinson's actions as both a violent homicide and a direct assault on democratic norms. The charge of aggravated murder carried statutory eligibility for capital punishment, with aggravating circumstances including political targeting and commission of the offense in the presence of a child. In opening arguments, prosecutors emphasized Robinson's deliberate targeting of Charlie Kirk for his political expression. Under Utah Code annotated 76.3.203.14, political targeting is not merely an enhancement, but an aggravator that elevates sentencing severity. Grunander argued that Robinson's crime was not a spontaneous act of passion, but a calculated attempt to silence a political voice. By citing Robinson's statements, social media activity, and communications with his roommate, prosecutors painted a picture of ideological fixation transforming into lethal violence.
25 years, that may be for life. Victim targeting enhancement in violation of Utah Code annotated 76-3-203.14
Defense counsel, appointed under Rule 8 to ensure qualified representation in capital cases, attempted to mitigate culpability by highlighting Robinson's mental health struggles and alleged disillusionment with political institutions. They argued that while Robinson was guilty of homicide, his actions lacked the premeditation necessary for a capital conviction. Legal analysts noted, however, that Utah's broad application of aggravating factors gave the prosecution a significant advantage. Witness testimony deepened the narrative. Erica Kirk, widow of the victim, provided a statement under the protection of a pretrial order. She described not only the personal loss, but the trauma inflicted upon her child, who was present during the shooting. Prosecutors used this testimony to underscore the aggravating factor of a violent offense committed in the presence of a minor, adding weight to their demand for the maximum penalty. Law enforcement testimony further established Robinson's obstruction. Detectives detailed his concealment of the weapon and destruction of clothing evidence. They introduced text messages Robinson instructed his roommate to delete, as well as warnings he issued to remain silent if police questioned him, reinforcing the tampering charges. Media coverage amplified each development. Conservative outlets framed Robinson as a radicalized political extremist, while progressive outlets highlighted the dangers of a political culture where violent rhetoric bleeds into action. Legal commentators stressed that the trial was not only about Robinson's guilt, but about how the judiciary would address the broader crisis of political violence.
Tyler James Robinson intentionally selected Charlie Kirk because of Tyler James Robinson's belief or perception regarding Charlie Kirk's political expression.
In closing arguments, prosecutors urged the jury to impose the death penalty, asserting that Robinson's political targeting made the crime an existential threat to free speech and democratic participation. They argued that failing to impose the maximum sentence would embolden others to view violence as a legitimate form of political expression. Defense counsel countered with pleas for mercy, citing Robinson's personal struggles, but their arguments fell flat against the prosecution's framing of the crime as calculated, symbolic, and devastating. The jury deliberated under intense public attention, with cameras outside the courthouse capturing every update. When the verdict was read, Robinson was convicted on all counts: aggravated murder, felony discharge of a firearm, obstruction of justice, witness tampering, and violent offense in the presence of a child. Each enhancement and aggravator was upheld, leaving sentencing as the only unresolved question. Sentencing proceedings drew further national attention. Victim impact statements delivered by Kirk's family underscored the profound loss. Erica Kirk's testimony described her husband as both a father and a public figure whose absence left a void in their home and the movement he built. Political allies of Kirk argued that the murder was emblematic of a broader campaign of intimidation against conservative voices. The judge's sentencing remarks framed the crime as an attack not just on an individual, but on the nation's democratic framework. He noted that America's legal system is premised on the right to participate in public discourse without fear of violence. By targeting Kirk for his political beliefs, Robinson attempted to undermine that principle. Citing Utah's statutory aggravators, the judge concluded that the death penalty was justified under the circumstances.
Tyler James Robinson committed criminal homicide in the physical presence of a child younger than 14 years of age, with knowledge that a child was present and that may have been seen or heard the commission of the criminal homicide.
The courtroom atmosphere grew tense as the judge prepared to deliver the sentence. Spectators reported a palpable silence, punctuated only by the clicking of cameras from the press pool. Robinson, who had remained mostly stoic throughout the proceedings, shifted visibly as the words "sentenced to death" were spoken. Within moments, he collapsed at the defense table, clutching his chest and sliding to the floor. Court security rushed to his side, while paramedics were summoned to evaluate his condition. Footage of Robinson's collapse circulated instantly across social media and news outlets. Clips replayed on cable networks showed the defendant slumping forward, an image that became symbolic of the weight of justice bearing down. Some commentators described it as the physical manifestation of ideological extremism breaking under consequences. Others speculated about the sincerity of the collapse, suggesting it was a stress-induced fainting episode rather than a medical emergency. Regardless, the moment became the defining image of the trial. Senator Bernie Sanders reiterated his call for national unity against political violence, emphasizing that the spectacle of a defendant collapsing under a death sentence should not distract from the deeper issue, the normalization of violence in public life. Public reactions split along familiar lines. Some viewed Robinson's collapse as justice taking its toll, the final unraveling of a man who attempted to silence another through violence. Others cast it as evidence of a broken system, arguing that capital punishment only perpetuates cycles of brutality. Legal experts debated whether Robinson's collapse could affect appeals, but consensus held that it would not alter the sentence itself. The collapse crystallized the trial's significance. For millions watching, it symbolized the unbearable cost of political violence, the life of Charlie Kirk, the ruin of Tyler Robinson, and the corrosion of America's civic trust. Media outlets framed the collapse as a metaphor for the state of the nation, buckling under polarization, weakened by extremism, yet forced to confront the consequences in stark terms. By the conclusion of sentencing, Robinson was transferred into high-security custody, awaiting appeals that would take years but were unlikely to overturn the death penalty. The trial and its dramatic conclusion became a national reference point, cited in debates on political rhetoric, free speech, and the boundaries of lawful dissent. For Kirk's supporters, it was closure. For America, it was a warning. Legacy, polarization, and the collapse of American democracy. The collapse of Tyler James Robinson at his sentencing hearing did not conclude the story, but instead marked the beginning of a new and volatile chapter in America's political narrative. Within hours of the incident, footage of Robinson fainting as the death penalty was read spread across television networks, Twitter, TikTok, and YouTube. The image of a convicted murderer crumpling beneath the weight of justice became a rallying point for competing interpretations of what the trial symbolized. For some, it was the visible end of a radicalized man's journey from political grievance to criminal annihilation. For others, it was exploited as evidence of a justice system acting with cruelty, perpetuating a cycle of vengeance rather than resolution. Media framing diverged sharply. Conservative outlets portrayed the collapse as the ultimate unraveling of a political assassin, underscoring the righteousness of the death penalty. Liberal outlets stressed the dangers of capital punishment, framing Robinson's collapse as proof of the barbarity of state-sanctioned death. The incident became a flashpoint in debates not only about political violence, but also about America's broader justice system. The trial that had begun as an indictment of one man's actions now stood as a referendum on the nation's ability to uphold democratic values without descending into reciprocal extremism. Charlie Kirk's death reverberated through the conservative movement he had helped build. As founder of Turning Point USA, Kirk had cultivated a youth-centered base, committed to advancing conservative ideas on college campuses and social media. His supporters framed his assassination as proof of escalating hostility toward right-wing voices. Turning Point USA launched initiatives honoring his legacy, organizing rallies and conferences that portrayed Kirk as a martyr for free expression. Speeches delivered in his name frequently emphasized the need to resist political intimidation, transforming his death into both a memorial and a mobilization tool.
Political violence is abhorrent and anathema to the highest ideals of this country. It corrodes us and threatens the very foundations of our democracy.
The political right also used the trial to argue for stronger protections for public figures. Republican lawmakers introduced legislation aimed at enhancing penalties for politically motivated violence, echoing provisions already applied in Robinson's case. Some proposed measures went further, including expanded surveillance of extremist groups and harsher sentencing guidelines. Critics warned that such legislation risked curbing free speech in the name of security, raising the possibility of authoritarian overreach. On the left, leaders like Senator Bernie Sanders continued to stress the universality of the threat. He urged Americans not to weaponize Kirk's death as partisan ammunition, but to confront the broader normalization of violence. Progressive commentators echoed this, noting that acts of violence had targeted both right-leaning and left-leaning figures in recent years, underscoring the danger of selective outrage. Former President Donald Trump, however, intensified the divide. His reaction to Robinson's collapse was to dismiss it as media theater, a distraction engineered by what he labeled the fake news establishment. He accused Democrats of exploiting Kirk's death to undermine conservative voices, despite his own record of inflammatory rhetoric being widely scrutinized. Trump's remarks reinforced his strategy of turning every national crisis into partisan fuel, further polarizing the national discourse.
President Trump did not. Instead, he blamed Democrats for their rhetoric. The man who told a crowd of supporters that maybe the Second Amendment people should do something about Hillary Clinton.
The aftermath also saw renewed debate about the role of online radicalization. Investigations revealed Robinson had frequented extremist forums where violent rhetoric was normalized and political opponents dehumanized. These spaces amplified his grievances and validated violence as a legitimate solution. Analysts argued that such digital ecosystems, left unchecked, would continue to produce individuals like Robinson, isolated, radicalized, and primed for violence. Social media platforms faced criticism for failing to intervene against radical content, though defenders claimed censorship risked curtailing free expression. International observers watched the trial closely, with foreign media framing it as evidence of American democracy in crisis. Commentaries in European outlets warned that the US was entering a dangerous cycle of escalating violence fueled by populist leaders and polarized media. They argued that the murder of a high-profile political figure and the dramatic collapse of his killer in court illustrated the fragility of American institutions under pressure. Some compared it to moments in other nations where political assassinations preceded democratic backsliding. The judicial process following Robinson's sentencing turned toward appeals, a standard feature of death penalty cases. Defense attorneys argued that Robinson's collapse highlighted his mental instability, grounds for re-evaluation of sentencing. Legal experts, however, largely dismissed the likelihood of reversal, noting the thorough application of statutory aggravators and the jury's unanimous decision. Appeals could delay execution for years, but the symbolic impact of the sentence had already reshaped national discourse. For Kirk's family, the conclusion of sentencing provided a measure of closure, but not resolution. Erica Kirk, protected under pre-trial orders throughout the process, continued to emphasize her husband's legacy as both a public figure and a father. She publicly thanked supporters while calling for an end to political violence. Her statements, widely circulated in the press, were framed as dignified and resolute, contrasting with the vitriol dominating online discourse. Cultural reactions extended beyond politics. Artists, filmmakers, and musicians began referencing Kirk's death and Robinson's collapse in works exploring the consequences of extremism. Documentaries chronicled the rise of Turning Point USA, the toxic political climate of the 2020s, and the descent of Robinson from online radicalization into violence. The collapse became a cinematic image, played in loops across platforms, analyzed in slow motion, dissected for meaning. It symbolized for many the weight of consequences crushing not only one man, but an entire culture of extremism. Debates about capital punishment were reignited. Abolitionists pointed to Robinson's collapse as evidence of the cruelty inherent in death sentences, arguing that life imprisonment would have served justice without perpetuating violence. Proponents countered that the death penalty was justified in cases where crimes threatened not only lives, but democratic stability. Utah's use of capital punishment became a case study in law schools and political science courses, with Robinson's trial frequently cited as a landmark in applying political targeting aggravators. Politically, the trial's fallout influenced the 2026 midterm elections. Republicans leveraged Kirk's death to rally conservative voters, framing themselves as defenders of free speech under assault. Democrats used Robinson's conviction to highlight the dangers of political extremism, linking it to Trump-era rhetoric. Campaign ads on both sides featured footage of Robinson's collapse, repurposed to support opposing narratives. Analysts warned that the exploitation of such imagery risked further inflaming tensions rather than resolving them. The FBI and Department of Homeland Security expanded investigations into politically motivated threats following the trial. Reports indicated a rise in threats against public officials across the spectrum, from school board members to members of Congress. Kirk's assassination and Robinson's collapse became reference points in official assessments of domestic extremism. The government began to categorize politically motivated lone actor violence as one of the most pressing security threats facing the nation.
Freedom and democracy is not about political violence. It is not about assassinating public officials. It is not about trying to intimidate people who speak out on an issue.
Historians and sociologists situated the murder within a long lineage of American political violence. They noted how assassinations and attempted assassinations of presidents, governors, legislators, activists, and even musicians had punctuated U.S. history, often signaling turning points in public life. Robinson's collapse in court was interpreted as a contemporary echo of that lineage, embodying both the personal failure of extremism and the collective crisis of democracy under attack. As appeals wound through the courts, Robinson became an unlikely figure in extremist subcultures. While mainstream society viewed him as a murderer justly condemned, fringe groups attempted to recast him as a political prisoner. Online forums glorified his actions, spreading conspiracy theories that the trial was manipulated to silence dissent. This digital mythologizing of Robinson alarmed analysts, who feared that rather than deterring violence, the case risked inspiring copycats. By the end of 2025, Charlie Kirk's assassination and Robinson's collapse had hardened into cultural memory, not just as tragic milestones, but as unmistakable inflection points. The trial, sentencing, and public reaction were never confined to the sterile boundaries of a courtroom. They became shorthand for a nation where rhetoric and violence had fused into a single continuum. Each headline, each viral clip of Robinson slumping to the ground carried symbolic weight, a cautionary tale, a rallying cry, or a weaponized meme. depending on which side of the divide one stood. The consequences spread outward in concentric circles. In Congress, hearings weaponized the case as evidence of either unchecked extremism or partisan hypocrisy. On the campaign trail, candidates cited Kirk's death to frame opponents as complicit in a culture of hate. In schools and universities, debates over free speech versus political safety sharpened into bitter fault lines. International commentators used the assassination as proof that American democracy was fraying, exporting its dysfunction abroad. And in the shadowy corners of digital subcultures, Robinson's name became a point of fixation, either condemned as a coward or reframed as a martyr, fueling the very extremism the trial had been meant to extinguish. In the final analysis, Robinson's collapse in court captured the collapse of civility, the collapse of democratic restraint, and the collapse of individuals consumed by ideology. It stood as a warning that in America's polarized landscape, unchecked rhetoric could harden into violence, and violence could destroy both lives and the civic bonds that hold the nation together. Well, that's it for this video. But don't go anywhere because we've got plenty more heat for you. Just tap any of the cards on your screen right now and keep it locked.